This is a conversation with Tim Mack, a journalist based in Ukraine and a founder of the Counteroffensive, a new type of a media organization trying to bring authentic reporting from the war and from Ukraine in general. I spoke to Tim to learn about how everything that's been going on is seen and perceived in Ukraine. How is the Ukrainian government trying to work with the United States after they cut off its military aid and intelligence sharing? What are their options? And whether they have a strategy for what to do. We spoke about the impact of what it might have on the Ukrainian military and the war in general, on the changes in the public opinion on peace deals and war negotiations, or about the reality of the critical minerals deal between the United States and Ukraine, and what all that is really about, and much more. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk about everything that's been happening recently and how it's reflecting and how it's being seen from Ukraine. But maybe before that, for the people who don't know you and don't know the counteroffensive and what it does, could you maybe briefly describe what the counteroffensive is, what you're trying to do, and how you personally ended up based in Ukraine?
Well, the what the company is a lot shorter story than how I ended up here. But I'll start with what it is that we do. So the Counteroffensive is a publication based here in Kyiv, Ukraine, and we wanted to take a different approach to war correspondence and journalism. So rather than just telling you what happened, we do human interest style journalism, so human narrative journalism. So we introduce you to a person, and you learn about that person's life, and in learning about that life, you learn about a different aspect of the news. And so we look at the news not just as a bunch of events happening to people, but but by putting people first in our coverage of the news. And so that's the way we do our journalism. So as for how I got here, I mean, it's just one of those things. You wake up one day, you're living in a war zone. Uh, I've been a journalist for more than 16 years now, and most of that has been in Washington D.C. I'm also a former U.S. Army medic, which I spent on the reserve side for 5 years, and those two aspects of my life kind of combined together in 2022 when I got sent to Kyiv in case a war might break out. I was sent there by NPR, where I was a correspondent at the time. And I arrived, as it happens, the night the war broke out, just a few hours before the invasion started. And in one way or another, I've been running around Ukraine ever since. I reported on the war for NPR as a correspondent for most of the first year of the war, and then left and started the counteroffensive in the spring of 2023.
And I would recommend everyone to go and sign up and read the counteroffensive. I'll leave the link in the description because it is really different to a lot of the other writing that you can find. And you don't only focus on the war itself, but other aspects of life in Ukraine.
Yeah, we really try to make Ukraine not just as a place where violence is occurring. We go deep into, the culture, the history, and the geopolitics of the situation through human stories first. We don't want Ukraine to just be covered and written about as a place where people are dying. Although of course people are dying, and there's a very serious aspect to this war. We want to make sure, though, that people understand that Ukraine is worth covering in and of itself. So we have really interesting and deep coverage of Ukrainian fashion, linguistics, history, culture, and so on and so forth. It's a really important part of what our mission is to go much deeper than typical news coverage has been able to go.
Well, I want to take advantage of the unique perspective that you have and kind of get a bit of an inside look on everything that's been happening and how it's perceived within Ukraine, since you also have a number of Ukrainian members and journalists on your team. And I think maybe a good way to start would be to go back a little bit and talk about what might have been expectations for Trump before he was elected, and then when he after the election, and how are Ukrainians, and I guess both the general public and the political sphere, how have they been perceiving everything that's been happening, from the argument in the White House to cutting off of the U.S. military aid, and the pretty abrupt and very, very significant deterioration of the relations between what was up till now by far the most important Ukrainian ally?
Yeah, this is a really interesting series of questions, but let's go back to 2024 and the election of Donald Trump. I think in Ukraine, there was a real understanding that the war had reached a stagnant point and a really deep frustration with the Biden administration over the course by the end of by the election, by the presidential election in 2024. That is, that a lot of Ukrainians were looking at the Biden administration as dragging their feet, as not willing to provide the decisive assistance necessary to Ukraine, um, of taking way too long to approve military aid transfers. You'll remember that for for a period of years, Ukraine could not target Russian assets inside of Russian territory because it was prohibited from doing so using American weapons into Russian territory because the Biden administration feared an escalation. Everything from the Biden administration's dragging of its feet on HIMARS, ATACMS, F-16s, various weapon systems, which the Ukrainians felt that it needed to succeed on the battlefield. It felt that the Biden administration was either too cautious or, in the worst interpretation, actively using Ukraine as a way to drain the military resources of America's adversary in Russia, and using Ukrainian lives to drain them. And that led to a great deal of frustration. Although in hindsight, it really was a very small level of friction compared to what we see now. But going back to November, when Donald Trump was first elected, there was a real hope among many Ukrainians here in Kyiv, in the political classes, that Trump, while chaotic, may be the kind of chaos agent necessary to disrupt this war and push it towards an end with Ukraine, to Ukraine's benefit. I think we've seen in the months since that optimism was poorly placed, but you could not you could not have found a lot of purchase for that view in November of 2024. I think there was some real hopes. And recall, we're talking now about critical minerals deal, a deal between the United States and Ukraine over future critical minerals or energy resources that may be extracted and sold by the state. Um, this was something that was originally proposed by the Zelensky administration. That is, that they thought, okay, we have a transactional American president coming into office. Let's transact. Let's give him something to do. They didn't expect, however, the particular attitude that the Trump administration came into office with, which is a almost quasi colonial view towards Ukraine, that you are to do what we say, and by the way, where's our thank you? And that's been the predominant approach from the Americans now, and that's been, uh, I haven't talked to that many people about it, but I think that if you're going to compare from the Ukrainian perspective, the foot dragging and public support of the Biden administration to the public antagonism of the Trump administration, and a not just a foot dragging, but a severance of the military aid to Ukraine, I think they now just say, well, we had it good during the Biden administration.
I would say definitely, even myself, I had some level of optimism for Trump, and that perhaps he could add to the mix something that was missing during the Biden administration. And I think that was, as you said, very poorly placed. What do you think is the view or expectations in Ukraine of what the United States is doing now? How are they seeing the relationship. And I think on that note, maybe I'd be interested in hearing your own personal take on that as well. What do you think that the United States is trying to achieve at this point in Ukraine with everything that's been doing? What do you think is the strategy or the goal they're pursuing?
Well, let me say that if anything, the coverage in most of the mainstream press has insufficiently described the level of absolute betrayal that Ukrainians feel from their American partners. This is, I think it's been poorly described in the mainstream press with regards to Ukraine's view towards America, but also poorly described in terms of Europe's feeling of betrayal towards the United States. That is, that some of America's closest friends have decided, and this is a generational shift, one that is going to have probably implications for you and me for the rest of our lives about who can we trust and who can we partner with and who can we sell to and who can we do business with. And right now what we're seeing is a total reshaping of who we once thought were our friends, and reshaping of which I think there isn't a parallel going all the way back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so this is a once in every 3 decades type phenomenon, right? It's pretty dramatic, and I think it's not to America's benefit. What you've asked me the question of what the United States is trying to accomplish, and I think it's a wise question to ask, but it may not be the right question that gives us the insight into what we're ultimately looking for. We spend a lot of time trying to provide a post hoc explanation for Trump's decision making. We try to create grand theories of what he may be doing or what this White House is interested in doing, when there probably is no grand strategy or plan. There is no 3D chess being played, and that it is as simple as the fact that Donald Trump admires Vladimir Putin and has admired him for many years, going back to his time in business, in which Donald Trump was interested in doing business in Russia with regards to a Trump hotel and many other types of business dealings. This is not really a controversial thing that he tried to do that, and it's certainly not controversial. It's all been public that Donald Trump has expressed some deep admiration for Vladimir Putin over the years. It is as simple as that. Now, we as analysts and observers, we who talk with academics, this is not satisfying to us because we want to have sort of grand strategies, and we have books to write, and so like the theoretical approach is that some sort of détente with Russia will lead Russia to disentangle itself from its relationship with China, thus allowing for a kind of new world order where conflict around the world among great powers, the possibility of that is dramatically reduced. And the United States can spend a lot less in its defense and live in a more peaceful world. That is the most generous interpretation of the facts. I don't think, it's a strategy that anyone really has in mind. They may be trying to apply it after the fact. And B, I don't think it's going to work. But that's the interpretation. That is the most generous interpretation. I think the simplest response and answer is simply that Donald Trump admires Vladimir Putin, and that's why he wants to be friendly with him.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. I think that what you've said about the feeling of betrayal in Europe and in Ukraine, and how probably it's not that felt as much in the United States or understood that much in the United States. I think that's a really good point. I'm from the Czech Republic, which is a former post-communist country, and there is a large segment of the population that, especially people from the generation of my parents who partly grew up during the communism era, who grew up really admiring the United States and the role in the world, and saw the United States as a force for good. And I think for a lot of people, like, their view of the world and their view of the US has really been shattered in a very, very radical way. So I can or can't imagine that in Ukraine, that's even more directly affected by it, how strong it must be. But it leads me to another question of, when we were talking about the motivations behind what the United States is doing, is how is the Ukrainian government trying to approach all of that? Because I feel like that's an incredibly difficult situation to be in, where compared maybe to Biden administration that had its flaws, you're now in a lot more tricky situation where you're probably not sharing the same ideas of understanding or maybe even basic interests on what should happen. Do you think that the Ukrainian government has a plan, or do you think that it's just trying to react to things as they go?
Yeah, I mean, what's obvious is that the United States no longer has Ukrainian victory, however you might define that, no longer has Ukrainian victory as a primary motivator and goal. What is obvious is that what the Trump administration is trying to do is trying to get some sort of peace, whether it's a sustainable peace, whether it's a just peace or not. As long as they're able to hold it up, they're willing to do it. And what they're not acknowledging is that Ukraine, as an independent and sovereign country, has its own separate interests that are separate, that are very different from the Trump administration's interests. Um, Another thing that's been very poorly understood is the domestic pressures that Zelensky is under among his own people, and the consequences that will be in place if Ukraine were to sign a weak peace deal or a humiliating peace deal, or one in which they sacrifice significant amounts of their sovereignty to procure. Um, there is a very substantial portion of the Ukrainian population that would protest or even revolt. There is, I don't know whether it would be the case, but there is the potential for civil unrest if if the civilian government of Ukraine were to be seen as betraying the soldiers on the front line, and by signing a deal that gives away large portions of Ukraine or gives up its ability to defend itself in the long term. That should be something that American negotiators are aware of. And so when we looked at this Zelensky Trump Oval Office dust up, a lot of coverage revolved around the personalities of it and what was said, but like the reason why Zelensky was so firm and so insistent on security guarantees partly was due to his character and partly was due to his personality, but significantly also because he has to sell this deal eventually. And he is under a tremendous amount of domestic political pressure over what the nature and contours of that deal will be. So if he doesn't bring a deal that he can sell, it's going to be the end of him politically, but it's also going to mean some very negative developments in Ukrainian society, which he understands and can anticipate if he comes up with a deal that, for example, limits the size of the Ukrainian military or gives up land that they hadn't lost on the battlefield. I mean, or leads to another war in 18 months or 12 months. Is just not what he can. He needs to sell this to his domestic audience, and that's been poorly understood outside Ukraine too.
I think that's such a good point to bring up, and to keep in mind that it's not actually only Zelensky's decisions, but that he kind of needs to do what the domestic population wants him to do. But on that note, what would majority of Ukrainians want at this point? Because I think that I saw a few weeks ago that there was a recent poll from Ukraine that for the first time said that the majority of Ukrainians would prefer or accept some kinds of concessions of giving up certain parts of territory in exchange for peace right now, which is not the same as giving up or limiting their sovereignty. But it does seem that this public opinion in Ukraine is changing as well. What would you say the majority of Ukrainians would prefer at this point?
This is one of those things that is incredibly difficult to survey and ask questions about. And I feel like when I ask 100 different Ukrainians, I get 100 different answers because the nature of peace involves many different components, to include territory, to include the nature of ceasefires, to include political changes. For example, it's been floated that Ukraine must hold elections within a certain time frame of a ceasefire. It's been floated that Zelensky must step down. It's been floated that various territories be given up. It's been floated that there be a cap on the size of the Ukrainian military. It's been floated that the peace deal involves some compromise on which countries ought to be allowed to be peacekeepers. Russia has, for example, suggested that they have a veto over which nations get to contribute peacekeeping forces. So it's a much more complicated situation than merely are you willing to give up territory, and we will really not know the Ukrainian perception of the deal until we know more details of the deal. That being said, there's an increased willingness for some sort of deal. I think that's clear to say. But the people who are most against having a deal of any kind are the people who are most, generally speaking, who are the people in society who are most armed, who are most frustrated about the situation on the battlefield, and the ones who feel most traumatized and actually betrayed, and will feel most betrayed by any sort of deal, right? And so we have to understand that each person's opinion does not have equal weight in terms of the outcome that comes next. Some people are more inclined to act as a result of their opinions than others. And the people most inclined to act, demonstrate, protest, or more as a result of a bad deal, even though they may be a smaller number or a plurality that's less than a majority, you have to be concerned about what the peace looks like afterwards, because it may be a very turbulent time.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. You've mentioned that in case there was a weak deal or a weak peace that would lead to something that's not perceived well in the Ukrainian society and that would not be probably long-term sustainable, it could lead down to some pretty bad consequences, and I understand as political consequences. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more, of what kind of scenarios can you imagine, or what are some of the things that you would be worried about?
Well, it could be as innocuous as just a new president, and that's certainly something that's normal and healthy in any sort of democracy. But it could become civil unrest and demonstrations, and it could even turn violent. I mean, it's not at all. It would not be it would not be inconceivable from my mind that there would be violence as a result of a bad deal. You have to remember that the people who would be most upset about a bad deal would be people who are armed, well trained, and very angry as a result of the war. This would hardly be the first war that led to internal conflict as a result of the terms of the deal. Although a very different situation, World War II and World War I, you could draw a through line between the terms of the Versailles Treaty and the outbreak of World War II. In the same way, displeasure over this peace could lead to serious repercussions. It is not enough merely to have peace. So this is another major divergence in what the Trump administration wants and what Zelensky's government wants. The Trump administration merely wants peace so that they can say that they solved this problem. The Zelensky administration has a long-term perspective on this and a domestic focused perspective on this, which is they not only want peace, but they want a peace that they can actually live with, and that they could sell to their look in the mirror at the end of the day and say, we did the best we can to produce an outcome that was fair to us. The Trump administration doesn't seem to understand it and seems they can just bully the Zelensky administration into accepting any terms. I think they've overplayed their cards in that sense.
Well, so what do you think is going to happen? Because I see it exactly the same way, and I think that Trump administration just wants peace regardless of what it would look like. So it's probably trying to push Ukraine into a deal that wouldn't be very good for it. But as you've mentioned, Zelensky, because of these domestic, not only, but also because of these domestic political pressures, cannot accept that kind of a bad deal, whatever it would look like. So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that Trump administration, if they keep pushing, they might get to a point where they would get Ukraine to agree to it? Or do you think that Ukraine would just accept that the aid is not coming back, the intelligence sharing is not coming back, and they would try to adapt and pursue this on their own?
Well, we're talking right now during a period of real political uncertainty, right? That there's still the resumption of intelligence sharing could happen at any moment, and we're talking now before Ukrainian and American negotiators get together and speak in Saudi Arabia, where they may well come to some sort of conclusion, which I can't predict at this particular point. The thing is that that as Trump has cut things off, he's also reduced his leverage, right? As Trump has said, I'm not going to send military aid, I'm not going to share intelligence with you. Ukraine has two kind of responses to it. One is, we really need that stuff. What can we do in the near term to try to secure as much of it as we can? But secondly, why would we want to deal with a partner who clearly does not have our interests in mind and doesn't seem to be playing particularly fair, and certainly does not view us as a peer, right? And so you've seen all the scrambling in Europe over the last couple of weeks, all around this idea that we can no longer trust the United States to be a partner and dedicated to our collective defense. And this has serious implications for the whole world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But maybe just to double down on that. So if I understand it correctly, you don't think that Ukraine could be bullied into this, whatever deal Trump has in mind, but you don't think that it's possible, probably regardless of the pressure or different ways that the US could come up with, it's probably not going to work out.
There are two views I have. One, my view is, don't deal with Trump because you cannot trust him. And the second that he gets concessions from you, he's going to turn around after a slight pause and demand more. Secondly, from the Ukrainian perspective and from the European perspective, this is not a light switch that you could turn on and off and pretend like it didn't happen, right? That's the second you've decided to use relationships, friendships, partnerships forged over decades, many times as a result of blood shed together, and say, I'm willing to shut that off. You've turned a corner from which there is no return, which is that I cannot trust you as a partner and as an ally, and I'm going to have to make alternate arrangements. And even if in the near term the United States resumes intelligence sharing, resumes some level of military aid, everyone will understand, and the Ukrainian government will be very aware of the fact that it could end at any time. And if that's the case, they're going to be extremely wary about putting too much trust in that relationship. Trust is one of those things that takes years and years and years to build, and just a moment to lose all of it. And what's happened over the course here, I don't think that the Trump administration realizes just how much trust they've lost in Ukraine and in Europe, and how they're not going to be, for the duration of the term, they're not going to be seen as reliable partners. And that's going to have huge impacts for politics.
Yeah, I think that the impact of everything that has happened and how much damage it cost to the 80 years of European American alliance, like that hasn't really sunk in, but it's probably going to at some point, and we'll see how monumental it was. On the note of the cut in the US military aid and the intelligence sharing, which potentially could be even more important, what are you hearing from people in the Ukrainian government, officials, military? What have been the impacts of that so far, and what might be, or how damaging it might be in the near and midterm future? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.